Securities offered through Cetera Advisor Networks, LLC, member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through CWM, LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. Cetera Advisor Networks, LLC is under separate ownership from any other named entity. Carson Partners, a division of CWM, LLC, is a nationwide partnership of advisors. This is The Way to Wealth, with host Scott Ford, a jiu-jitsu fighting, woodworking, beekeeping entrepreneur who is also the managing director, partner, and wealth advisor of Carson Wealth. Financial freedom is the goal, and clarity and simplicity is how we'll get there. Let's get to it. This is Way to Wealth.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Way to Wealth podcast, where we're all about making money simple, allowing you to focus on living life fully and doing that today, because ultimately that's all we really have. So instead of 40 years from now, we're focused on today. So I'm very excited this week to have a guest, Gemma Stone. And Gemma was introduced to me by Andrea Randall and said that we needed to meet and connect. And so doing some due diligence, looking at Gemma's background and then some of the things she wanted to talk about today, it's very clear why we're supposed to meet and connect actually today, specifically on this topic, on various topics. And so first, welcome to the Way to Wealth podcast, Gemma.
Thank you so much, Scott. I'm really delighted to be here.
Yeah, excited about this conversation. And again, everything's in time and on right on point, and this clearly is. So just a little bit of background on Gemma, and then I'll let you share a little bit of that with us. Gemma, as my audience may or may not know you. So over 20 years, Gemma's offered behind-the-scenes psychological support to leaders and entrepreneurs, which is typically our audience. Her work blends a few degrees in psychology and business acumen with a generous handful of postgraduate training in trauma processing, neuroscience, hypnotherapy, neurolinguistic programming, and more. There's a lot in there. One of the things that I highlighted in your bio, Gemma, is talking about studies that have shown that 72% of leaders and entrepreneurs are directly or indirectly affected by mental health issues, which is near and dear to my heart. And that's been my experience as well, is that, it can be lonely, and, there has been a pattern for even on depression, which is, of course, is a mental health issue with entrepreneurs and business owners. And so totally in line with that. And what I haven't mentioned, certainly two big things I'm up to. One is making the money clean. So we'll talk about that and how your work aligns to it. And second, making the invisible visible. One of the pieces that I'm referring to and making the invisible visible is candidly mental health, because ultimately there's a real crisis and pandemic in my mind that's going on around mental health. And ultimately, we all just want to be seen. And that's part of me when I'm saying making the invisible visible. Let these people just be seen, and let's not sweep it under the rug. And just that ultimately, it's what they want, is to be seen. And the focus of the Way to Wealth podcast is clearly about wealth and money. And audience knows this. The definition that we use for wealth is the original word weal, W-E-O-L. That definition is well-being. So really, that's what wealth is. It's just this sense of well-being. And the framework for this podcast is health, wealth, wisdom, and happiness. Because if we want well-being, we just want to live this bountiful, full life. And, I took that, taking ancient wisdom with modern day technology from Benjamin Franklin, and added happiness for exactly what we're talking about. So I wasn't around in his era that I know of. And, he talked about healthy, wealthy, wise. And to me, it's like today, yes. And what are we doing all that for if we're not happy? So that's what I'm up to. That's what we're about. That's what the podcast is about. Super excited to have you, and would love to start with some of your backstory, Gemma. Your work and what brought you to today and on this podcast. Would love for you to share that with the audience.
Thank you so much, Scott. So my story starts pretty much when I was born into the world. I had a head start on some really challenging psychological situations that resulted in trauma. And as a result, I struggled a lot with my mental health through when I was an adolescent. I struggled with panic attacks, depression, anxiety. Eventually, it morphed into an eating disorder. And the older I got, the worse it got. And so, of course, most people in my profession are actually trying to figure out themselves or their family first. So I went to university and I got a couple of degrees in psychology, trying to make sense of what was happening. And also, psychology just felt like a coming home to me. So when I started taking the courses, my very first one, I just had the sense of this is where I belong. So I continued along that path for quite a while. And the more work that I did, the more I realized that the training I received in my undergraduate, my graduate programs wasn't entirely sufficient to resolve the traumas that I had experienced and to create mental alignment for me so that I could begin to heal some of the challenges that were causing the mental health struggles. So I had an obsession with healing. I ended up reading a book a week for 10 years, trying to crack the code, gathered all of these different trainings and different psychological modalities, and eventually landed in the place where I started to become aware that there are different layers of healing that have to happen that go beyond just the conscious mind, which is primarily what I was trained in my undergrad and graduate program. So I developed these models to look at how do we bring healing to the conscious, subconscious, and unconscious, to the mind, body, and spirit, so that we can really begin to create lives and businesses that we love.
Yeah, I love that. And spot on, where we talk about health in our framework of spiritual, mental, and physical. So definitely very aligned. And thank you for sharing and being vulnerable to, share that part of your backstory. And ultimately, like we're all as 5-year-olds running around trying to figure this thing out. And it's part of my path. And the money piece is there were challenges early on for me financially with the family. And so I didn't understand what that was. And it sent me on this quest and down a bit of a rabbit hole, a good one, of figuring out money. It's like, it doesn't have to be this complicated. So it's just interesting how we're formed and what sends us on these various paths, and the why behind it's always cool to hear and know. And it's important. On that note, Gemma, I'm going to start right out of the gate with this question. Don't always do it like this, but we're talking about childhood. What would you say is your earliest memory of money growing up?
My earliest memory of money was feeling like there was never enough. My mom was a single parent, and she was the primary breadwinner. And it was always this feeling of there's never enough. And so I got a job when I started making money when I was really little. I figured out there wasn't enough. And if I wanted to have enough, I had to start hustling early. So I remember I think I was maybe 8 years old when I got my first job. It was just a paper route. And I went down, I had my paycheck, and I went down to the bank, and I somehow convinced the bank teller to let me put my money in my mom's bank account, because I had the sense of like, we're not okay, she's not okay, but if I work hard enough, maybe I can make it better.
Yeah. So there's certainly something to that. Cool. Again, thanks for sharing. And yeah, we all have, and certainly there's more, but I always like to ask what's the earliest memory, because it typically, leaves a mark, and not necessarily good or bad, just what it is. And there's just typically something that we can all relate to or learn from. As we hear these stories. So one of the things for me, and this is definitely some things I would love to talk about. And you have, all this various training and modality, from trauma processing to neuroscience, hypnotherapy to neuro-linguistic programming. So wherever you want to go with any of that, as far as where it feels applicable to share, would love to learn more, because that's not my area of expertise. What I am focused on is what I call the infinite entrepreneur. And the idea of the infinite entrepreneur is really 4 things. So it's an infinity symbol for one, and it's being in flow as an entrepreneur, business owner. And I want to be clear, I'm literally working to redefine, because words mean something. So what does entrepreneur really mean? Well, to me, what it means is actually bringing value and bringing resources in a reciprocal manner. So for me, it's a Legato family, which is how we met through Andrea, my partner there, and Rich, of creating clear family values and rites of passage, and just really clarity of who you are and why, from a value perspective, from a family. And then in business, we call it the 4 P's of a sustainable business: purpose, people, process, profits. Really clear there. Then the way to wealth, that's the process we use for the money piece. So let's make sure we're clear with the family, with the company business. And then now we vote with our dollars. Let's make sure our money matches and we're voting congruently with our family and company values. And then with those 3 in place, let's live a life of health, wealth, wisdom, and happiness. So all of that sounds great, and candidly is great. It's how I live, and it's what I'm here to do and bring forth and share. Having said that, the biggest hurdle to do any of that, in my mind and opinion, is family, the business and even the money is heal the trauma. And so that's why I'm so intrigued with your work. And, you had put something out here, creating mental alignment. So you had mentioned when we align the conscious, and you had mentioned it earlier, subconscious and unconscious levels of the mind, we're more able to create sustainable wealth. Talk more or share some about that if you would.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd be delighted to. So the way that I look at creating mental alignment is examining what's happening at the conscious, subconscious, and unconscious levels of the mind. So the conscious level is about 5 to 10%. That's thinking, rational, logical. That's the part that knows what we want and sets our goals. The subconscious part of the mind is much more powerful. So it's about 80 to 90%. And that's the part that's really running the show. So the analogy that I like to use to describe that is the conscious mind is like the rider, and the subconscious mind is like the elephant. So the elephant is much more powerful and really is ultimately in control. So if the rider wants to go left and the elephant wants to go right, you're going to have a battle. And eventually the elephant is going to win because it just has that strength and tenacity. So my work is looking at what consciously do you want when it comes to your health, your wealth, your relationships? Then subconsciously, what are the programs that are in your subconscious mind that are operating? Now, between the ages of 0 to 5, that's when we are always in our subconscious mind. So we're absorbing all of the beliefs and the experiences around anything in life, but we'll just talk about money for now. We're absorbing that from our environment, and we're getting a sense of how does our relationship with wealth feel in our bodies? How does it feel in our mind? Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? We're developing these neural pathways, which are a collection of thoughts, feelings, beliefs, behaviors, and memories. And we're forming our relationship with money and wealth in the subconscious part of the mind. And then the unconscious, those are things that influence us that we don't really know influence us. So sometimes these are traumas, sometimes these are repressed memories, sometimes these are multi-generational patterns. So I've worked a lot with people who have a pattern that's passed down generation to generation. And so they're struggling in their current life, and they're not aware that the source of the trauma is actually their grandfather that maybe had a trauma around wealth and that got passed down. Or the grandmother who lived through some type of like challenge where she felt like there was never enough. And so there's a scarcity mindset. So I love looking at what's happening at all 3 levels of the mind and how can we bring mental healing to all 3 levels so that there's this consistency. I love the word, like this sense of like coherence, like all of them are working together to help you move in the direction of whatever your dreams and goals are. After I worked with those 3 levels of mind, that's when I then started to work with the body. So I was really mind focused for about 15 years. And then I realized the missing piece is the body, which we could also go a little bit more deeply into. But when it comes to trauma processing, we need to heal the traumas at a mental and emotional level, but we also really need to heal the traumas at a physiological level as well.
Yeah, for sure. So I've talked about the reptilian brain and the fight or flight, and we all have that, and the thing that needs done is how can we transcend above that and get to so we come into this with this DNA that we're all have our own unique sequence based on genetics and ancestors, and you're talking about that, and that is passed down to you. How do we heal that? So my big question would be, and then in that, when you're in the reptilian brain and in the fight or flight, that's where scarcity is focused and hoarding is focused. And really what we want to do is get to a place of abundance, or instead of hoarding, how do we get to a space of flow? Well, first you got to heal the trauma to start transcending to get to there. 2 questions. One, well, I'm going to ask the question, but like we all have it. So how do we know? How does someone identify, oh, I have trauma, and what is the trauma? And then 2, what to do about it? How do we transcend and or heal that to get to a place of abundance and flow?
So there's a number of clues that trauma might be a player in life. One of the clues is if we have a clear sense of where we want to go in life and what we want to experience, and we're repeatedly hitting obstacles, that can sometimes be a trauma response. So our brain and our body are wired for 3 primary things: safety, love, and belonging. And so wealth is not included in that. So what can happen is that if we have a relationship with wealth where it feels unsafe, our mind will sabotage wealth because it wants to keep us safe. So an example would be, I was working with somebody who, when they were little, they watched a television show and they found that in the show, there was a lot of conflict around wealth. The couple was fighting about money all the time. So it wasn't a reality, but this little human's brain absorbed this feeling of, if I have wealth, I'm not going to be safe because there's going to be conflict. If I have wealth, I'm not going to have love because it's going to cause discord between the two of us. And so there was a psychological resistance to wealth because safety, love, and belonging were primary. So if you're noticing there's something that you want in your life and there's this barrier where you feel like you know what you want, but you can't get there, or you know what you want, but you're repeatedly losing it or feeling stuck around it, often there's a deeper need that's being met. And that deeper need is usually safety, love, or belonging. So your question around, like, how do we find out what that is? A lot of it is looking more deeply into what the root causes might be. So where did I learn that it was unsafe to build wealth? What beliefs do I have about wealth, and whose beliefs are those? Are those actually my beliefs, or are those the beliefs that I was handed by my society or my culture or my parents or my grandparents? Really beginning to unpack, like, who does this belong to and where does it belong? Sometimes it belongs to that 5-year-old that saw their parents fighting about money, or in my case, that feeling of there's never enough, but if you hustle hard enough, you can provide safety, love, and belonging for your family. So that's my story. So really diving a little bit more deeply into that can be helpful. Another feeling can be examining, how do you want to feel around a particular thing like wealth? And then how do you actually feel? So if you want to feel abundant, but what happens when you come into money or when you see people that have wealth, if you feel a sense of like tightness in your system, if your breath starts to get up into your lungs, if you feel a sense of aversion, like you just sort of like feel shut down, or you feel a sense of scarcity, that when there's a conflict between how you want to feel and how you actually do feel, often there's a root cause that is pushing you into an emotional response that is not aligned with what you're actually wanting to experience.
As far as what options someone could do or focus on to help transcend these feelings of scarcity, and if I'm a listener, I'm like, okay, all right, where do I start? Would be probably the better question.
Yes. So I really believe in going a little bit deeper than just the conscious part of the mind. So conscious therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy is really effective. And there's a lot of research around CBT, which is all about challenging your thoughts. I also believe when it comes to trauma, you want to go deeper than that. So there's different somatic experiences. So somatic experiencing is one of them, which is Peter Levine's work. You can do trauma therapies like accelerated resolution therapy is a newer one that's on the market that I absolutely love. You can also do something like eye movement desensitization reprocessing, which is EMDR. There's work called family constellation therapy. So if you're looking to go a little bit deeper into family systems, if you feel like maybe this is a lineage issue, then you can use some family constellation work. I love hypnotherapy because it allows you to get past this conscious part of the mind. It allows you to work deeper with the subconscious and the unconscious levels of the mind. So with hypnotherapy, you can do reprogramming work, or you can do reprocessing work. You can also do inner child therapy. If you feel like it comes from a childhood trauma, you can go and start to do some deeper work and like doing work with parts therapy. So internal family systems does a lot of work with that. So there's lots of modalities. I've trained in all of them, and I think they're all really useful for particular things, depending on what your sense is of where the trauma comes from, whether it's your own specific trauma, whether it's because of childhood experiences that were maybe you grew up with a conflict or scarcity, or whether it comes from a multi-generational pattern that's been passed down.
Yeah. And you do, as you said, all those modalities to include hypnotherapy.
Yes, absolutely. So that was part of my path, was really figuring out like, okay, I got to one level of healing, but there's still a lot of, it's almost like static. It feels like there's this conflict where I want to take like 2 steps forward, but then I end up taking 3 steps back. So every time I hit one of those barriers of like, okay, I got my mind right, but now my body is not responding. You talked about that fight or flight response. And in one of the modalities, we learn about the window of tolerance. So the window of tolerance is this place where we feel really grounded, present, and regulated. And I started to realize that as part of one of my survival strategies, because of the trauma that I went through, I was constantly in hyperarousal. So in that hyperarousal response, where you're in that fight or flight response, always running, always hustling. I was like chronically burning out, and then I would try to recover, and then I would burn out again. And then I would say I was going to say no to overwork, and then I would keep going because I had this process inside of me that said, there's never enough. You need to keep hustling in order for there to be enough for the people you love.
Yeah, it makes complete sense. And I believe I can relate to some of that. I read a book years ago called The Body Keeps the Score, and love that book. And it does, right? It's holding the truth. And so recognizing what you're feeling from that level definitely is another sign of, I had a situation in business at one point where just my neck and shoulders were so tight and like I couldn't move it. And it was just there. And there wasn't anything real physical going on from a health standpoint. It was just carrying, there's just carrying so much there, and just working through that, slowing down, meditation, processing, all these things to heal, because the body does truly keep the score and know what's going on. We're talking about resolving, and in this case, we'll say wealth trauma. So if there is wealth trauma or in the family system, obviously it can and will likely cause you to sabotage yourself financially. Can you give examples, maybe based on experience, of things that you've seen there where people have sabotaged themselves, and then what they did to overcome that?
Yeah, absolutely. I have so many examples. The one that comes to mind is I was working with this man who he would reach a certain level of success in his business. It was a very specific number. And then every time he reached that number, something would happen and he would lose everything. So either it was a business decision, something would go wrong. Sometimes it was an accident, like all of these strange synchronicities that would cause him to go back down to zero. Now, when we did this work and we looked a little bit more deeply in his family system, we saw that his grandfather was a very, very successful businessman. And when his grandfather hit a certain level of success, there was a fire in the company building and a number of people died. And at that point, he decided that he was going to no longer be in business. And he went into some religious work, so that he kind of took a vow of poverty at that point as a way to offer repentance for what had happened in his company and all the families that had lost their loved ones. So my client at the time didn't know about this connection, but unconsciously, every time he got to a certain level of wealth, he was really afraid that something terrible was going to happen. So before something terrible would happen, he would sabotage it. That's one example. That's that's family system type work.
Yeah.
There's other.
And it was in that case is an example, like that was in that man's DNA from his grandfather that was passed down and needed healed to break that pattern.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And it was such a tragedy and also such a mystery. And how frustrating is that, right? To know what you want and to be so close to achieving it, and then constantly feel like there's this glass ceiling that's just knocking you right down to the bottom and not knowing why. So you're right. That's an example of multi-generational trauma that was passed down in the family system. And we had to do some work to figure out unconsciously what was going on that was creating these subconscious systems that were consistently sabotaging the success he wanted to have.
Yeah, to me, it makes complete sense. And just another example of getting to the root issue, what's really the issue versus surface level. So I love the thought of really getting to root issues and going deep. You had mentioned a term, psychological evolution, and the psychological strategies that allow us to experience one level of success are often obstacles, probably like glass ceilings, to achieving the next level of success. And I know we touched on this earlier, but would love to learn more about that and maybe examples of that. And again, what someone could do to resolve or transcend that.
Yeah. So an example of that psychological evolution is that a lot of times when we go through difficult things or traumas, we develop survival strategies. And those survival strategies are appropriate for whatever we've been through, but they often have an expiry date where they are no longer very effective. So an example is working with a client, and she had a profound fear of poverty because she grew up in poverty. Her whole family system experienced a lot of poverty, and she was the one to get out of the poverty, which is actually remarkable because sometimes we see that people who have a system of poverty, they actually feel afraid to get out of it, because if they get out of it, they feel like they're going to lose belonging in that family system. That fear of like, if I become wealthy, then will I be judged, or will I be rejected, or will I still be loved? So she was able to achieve remarkable success despite this poverty system that she was growing up in. But what happened is this fear of poverty was driving her. So she had built and exited from multiple companies. She had enough wealth to sustain her entire family for multiple generations, and yet she was still driven. So she was depressed and desperate because she couldn't figure out what her next thing was. And she had this fear of, if I don't figure out the next thing, then we're not going to be okay. So this driver of wanting to get her family out of poverty actually really helped her to succeed. She was able to do remarkable things. But once she reached that level of success, it was no longer serving or supporting her because her families were falling apart. Her health was falling apart. She didn't need to keep driving, but she felt this subconscious urge to continue driving, even at the extent of sacrificing the things that were actually important to her now that she had achieved that level of stability for her family.
Yeah. And I've seen that, Gemma, even just so you think we're, business owners and entrepreneurs as an example, several exit to a big number, like their financial numbers more than they need. They don't always feel it. So there's two pieces to this. One, entrepreneur selling a company for a really big number. So reality is the number's big enough that they really never have to worry about money again, but they still do. And as much, I've seen them then get depressed. Multiple reasons. One that comes to mind to me is it was their identity.
Yeah.
That whole company was that was them. We know it's not, but it was to them. And so making sure if you're going to sell, which by the way, part of what we do is helping business owners build to exit. And you want to build to exit because in doing that, you're going to create a more profitable entity, which is your largest asset. And by the way, how you do that is creating more value for more people. That's how you create a more profitable entity. My point in stating it though is you make yourself replaceable or as irrelevant as possible. You're doing your unique thing. And now you can have life. You can live life. You can be healthy, wealthy, wise, and happy. You can separate your identity from this company. And I think that's where people, it's smart to build to exit. Because by the way, I don't know anyone who's not exited. We don't get out of this thing alive yet that I'm aware of yet. And so because of that, let's build for it so that, you can separate that right ahead of time and not have that traumatic experience where you sell and now your identity's gone and you fall into this depression. So I think that's critically important. And that's why I'm so intrigued with your work, because it dives into this. It's not just numbers on a financial spreadsheet, which wealth isn't anyway, but really just doing the real deep work so that you can separate your identity, who you really are, from your business. Certainly seems like a healthy thing to do. And I've witnessed it with business owners exiting. So I just put that out there that the work that you're doing, I think could also help resolve some of those challenges, traumas / depressions that business owners face.
That's so potent and so true. I've experienced that a lot, where either they exit and their identity dissolves, which is very alarming for the ego. Is to have an ego disillusionment is actually quite traumatic. So if you're able to really begin, like you said, to separate your identity from the things that you do, in addition to the things that you have, whenever we have an identity that's attached to something that we have or something that we do, when that leaves, which inevitably it usually does in some way, we can start to feel really fragile and vulnerable to mental health struggles. So when we're talking about how do you have the psychological evolution, it's about recognizing that what got you here might not get you there. And we need to consciously help to resolve whatever the traumas were that helped to get you here with certain survival strategies. And then also figure out what's going to get you to the next place. And what's the identity you need to be able to get to that next level where you can be healthy, wealthy, and wise in a really holistic, mentally aligned way?
Yeah, your work so ties to wealth and money. And another example I'll give, even not a business owner, but just someone retiring, you're going from a place of something that you've done, which could also be your identity. And you're going from this paycheck that's coming in, week after week for years and years and years. And oop, that stops. So now you're having to come up with where's that going to come from? And that 1-2 combo, typically the challenge to have a successful financial situation is mostly psychological. And so just that shift of, I don't have enough, and you're getting into scarcity, and then you need to make changes, and then you panic, and all these things are happening because of root issues. So your work definitely ties into wealth management. I find that fascinating. And I've done this since 91. So I have so many examples that I can relate of personally, as well as just working with clients that I've witnessed the need that a lot of it is psychological. Yeah.
I really believe like our mind is just this, has infinite capacity. We don't even really totally understand the power of the mind yet. But when we can harness what we do know, I think that the potential that's there it's just extraordinary. So I'm so grateful that you're including this type of orientation and perspective into wealth, because I've seen time and time again where people build wealth. So if you even if you think about people who win the lottery, so if we go outside of entrepreneurship and leadership, people win the lottery and all of a sudden, they think that's what's going to make them happy. And often it doesn't. And they end up right back where they were in a very short period of time, because that's where their psychological baseline is. Yes. So we all have these psychological baselines that are movable if we do the work to heal what's keeping us stuck and to be able to transcend to whatever level of experience we want to have next.
Yeah, without a doubt. And then, so we talk trauma, and then I'll just, look to wrap things up. And then I want to say, what's the best way for people to contact you? Because I love what you're up to, being healthy and whole and complete psychologically. And wow, what good we can do financially and otherwise in the world from that standpoint, and work towards that, being proactive each day to do something to maintain, sustain, and continue to even become healthier versus just focused on healing the trauma. This is just something on a proactive basis that really, I think we all should be focused on. I've heard the model, the I, we all, right? It's hard to be in relationships and be healthy if you're not. In fact, you're not going to be. Yet if you could focus on yourself to be mentally, physically, spiritually, emotionally healthy, that's work each day. From that space of wholeness, you can go to the we, which is your family relationships, your close relationships. From that, you can go to the all. And now we can start going to the community and the world. But it all starts with the I first, from a whole, healthy, complete place, which takes daily work.
It does. It does. I love what you're speaking about and feel so resonant with it, that I like to think of it as like a container. Like we all have our container of I have my container of me-ness, you have your container of you-ness, and that container holds our capacity. And we can strengthen our container. We can expand our container. We can plug whatever leaks might be draining our container. And the more we do that, the more we can hold for ourselves. And then that can just spill over into the people we love, and that can spill over into our community. So I think plugging those leaks, building the strength of that container, increasing our capacity to be healthy, wealthy, wise, happy, is really what's going to change ourselves, our relationships, and the world.
Yeah, well said. Thank you. And it makes me think of nature, because it's what nature does. Nature is reciprocal. It's looking for the good of the whole, and it works that way. And when you said the me being me, you being you, and all of us being our unique, what we've been created to be, versus a scarcity, I need to clinch to everything. No, actually, you need to be fully you and share that. And with all those different synergies like nature, that reciprocity, actually, we all do better, and individually we do better. So I love that. And that's it's part of why I do what I do on the way to wealth and the whole infinite entrepreneur concept, and focusing on bringing ancient wisdom to modern day technology and getting back to these natural laws that work.
Yeah. Well, I'm so grateful for the work you do. I feel like it's really that sort of evolution of wealth that I think our society desperately needs and is hungry for. I think people are looking for ways to be in relationship with their wealth that feels like it's integrity and feels like it's adding goodness to ourselves, our relationships, our family, and our communities in the world. So I'm just so appreciative of your orientation and all the different ways that you're supporting the good humans of the world to be healthy, wealthy, wise, and happy.
Yeah, well, thank you, Gemma. And it's like getting clear who we are as a family, as a business, and then using money. We vote with our dollars to support that and be in alignment. That's the mission. It's what we're here to do. It's making the money clean. Clearly, your work is a part of that, of healing the trauma and then looking to optimize mentally, physically, emotionally. So thanks for the work that you do and bring. If someone wants to learn more about you, I know you do coaching, specifically one-on-one coaching. What's the best way? You could talk more about that, and then the best way for people to reach out and connect with you.
Yeah, so the work that I do is really this one-on-one deep dive into all the different pieces we were talking about, creating awareness and alignment around what's happening consciously, subconsciously, unconsciously, checking the family system, checking the early childhood experiences to see where the trauma roots lie, resolving those mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually. And I love working with leaders and entrepreneurs because I really feel like they are the ones that are moving forward. I mean, you can even see this in the work that you're doing. Like, you are the next evolution in relationships to wealth in a way that is sustainable. I love how you talk about the cleanness of it. So for me, working with leaders and entrepreneurs is especially empowering because I know it trickles down. I know it trickles into families and communities and companies. And so that feels incredibly fulfilling. So I do one-on-one work, and all my information is over at gemmastone.org, gemmastone.org.
Beautiful. We'll put that in the show notes. Thank you for coming on and sharing and how you showed up and what you were able to bring to the conversation. I would, certainly strongly suggest anyone interested, please look up Gemma Stone and look at next steps and what feels right for you. So we'll hopefully have you back on, Gemma. You shared a lot of great wisdom and look forward to doing it again. And audience, thanks for joining another week of the Way to Wealth podcast, where we're all about making money simple so you can focus on living fully and doing that today. We'll catch you all next week.
The opinions voiced in Way to Wealth with Scott Ford, Managing Director, Partner, and Wealth Advisor of Carson Wealth, are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Investing involves risk, including possible loss of principal. No strategy assures success or protects against loss. To determine what may be appropriate for you, consult with your attorney, accountant, financial, or tax advisor prior to investing. Guests on Way to Wealth are not affiliated with CWM LLC or Cetera Advisor Networks LLC. Legato Family is not affiliated with Cetera Advisor Networks LLC or CWM LLC. Carson Wealth, 19833, Leitersburg Pike, Suite 1, Hagerstown, Maryland, 21742.